Dr. Evans, thank you for taking the time to meet today. This is a part of a series of pretty much informal and formal conversations that I have with different professionals, pretty much about their work relative to some specific topic of choice. And today, I'm hoping we can have a conversation about data and data documentation. And I'm specifically thinking about everything from do files. Maybe we talk a bit about documentation, do files at the start, and then we can segue into a conversation about artificial intelligence. So again, thank you for taking the time to meet today. To kick things off, could you introduce yourself, your professional background, all that good stuff?
Sure. So my name is Doug Evans, professor of criminology and criminal justice at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey. Also senior research associate at the Institute for State and Local Governance, which is a research and think and do tank through the City University of New York system, mostly funded by foundation grants, some city funding as well, and some federal and state grants. Oops, sorry, my dog's barking.
Oh, it's all
Um,
good.
Also teach in the prisons in New York and New Jersey as well, and do research on some of the issues about reentry, coming home from prison, and more recently about some record relief that's intended to reduce some of the stigma and open up new opportunities for people who are formerly convicted.
Sheesh. Yeah, yeah. I know your reputation speaks for itself, and hearing the gamut of kind of the hats you wear is going to be pretty cool to explore as we talk about data documentation because you're exposed to the university setting of research, but then also outside of the university setting, working with, again, governments and being on the ground in some way. So I'm wondering, to kick things off, in your experiences, what would you say are some of the most common documentation mistakes analysts, researchers make, and whether you can share some examples of where these mistakes can cause delays or error in a project or in efforts?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, if you write a big, long script of code, um, the biggest problem that I think I've encountered is not checking to make sure that it all runs successively in order. Because
Hmm.
ideally, if you spend a lot of time writing a script, you should be able to essentially, barring any notation otherwise, just select all the code that you've created and run it, and it should be able to run smoothly and do exactly what it is that you think or planned for it to do.
Yeah.
So I think, and that could be a number of things. That could be like something as simple as like a missed comma or a period or a missed character, or it could be something larger as like a block of code that is out of place that comes before another command that should have been run first.
Yeah.
It could be like a missing command that needs to be done. Like if you're doing something to a variable, but the variable's not there, then maybe you missed creating that variable. So just
Mm.
things like that, like out of order. And obviously that goes hand in hand with notation, which I think is a big part of this. As you mentioned, having strong notes for what the code does is really helpful. I like to think about it not as if I'm writing a code to a colleague because, the colleague likely knows as much, if not more, about the data coding program than I do. I think you
Mm.
want to write the code as if somebody who has never seen this coding language before can look at it and say, okay, based on this notation, I know exactly what this line of code does. It's very clearly, it's not written for some high level data analyst. It's written for just an average person on the street who can look at this and say, okay, I understand what this is doing to the data. And I think that helps because, in research, the majority of people in the world only see the final product. They don't see what goes into it. So I think being able to break it down to that level sort of invites the public to look more deeply into it. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, we have to make this stuff more publicly available so that people could benefit from that. But if you can have, a code sheet that's very well annotated and includes steps about what each code is doing, then I think that just helps make research more accessible to the public.
Yeah. Yeah. That's big. That's big. I guess it's safe to guess that you err on the side of heavy annotations in your do files. Like, is it a lot of green in there?
Sure, but I mean, sometimes I take shortcuts. I'm like, oh, this is an easy command. The command speaks for itself. I don't really need to address that. And I think in some cases that's okay if the command is very obvious.
Mm.
Just a few just basic, if it's something simple like deleting a variable, if
Yeah.
the code says delete and it has the variable, then that might be self-explanatory. If the code is like a save, we're saving a file or outputting a file. For the most part, that should be pretty self-explanatory, but anything that is more complicated than just a basic single command should be
Yeah,
annotated for sure.
I hear that. Have you ever had a situation where it's like someone gave you a file, or you were even looking at an older file that you worked with, and there was something you didn't understand, or there were mistakes, or anything that sort of delayed moving forward with kind of that analysis or investigation?
Sure. So one example I think about, you've mentioned Stata and DOFiles, is that you can create temp files with Stata to save space. So you're not actually creating I don't want to call it a physical file because it doesn't exist, but you're not like hard coding that file on your computer. So you
Mhm.
can create these temp files. But if you don't know this, you're going to mess this up because you have to run all the temp files together in order for whatever code you're doing to that temp file to run all the way through. You can't just run it one line at a time. Otherwise, state is going to get confused. So if I've had that happen before where somebody gave me a do file and didn't note that because I didn't really work with temp files before that. So I'm like running line by line and things aren't working. I'm getting error messages and I'm not understanding what's going on. And there's no notation that says you need to run lines 86 through 312 all at once. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. So I kind of had to figure that out through trial and error.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So then, I guess applying this to, let's say, your personal workflow for like keeping track of certain things, and you may have pointed to this already, in deciding what level of detail is enough in your code, what you comment and such. Um, is there any other kind of tips or things you tend to focus on just for your own personal flow of doing the day-to-day data cleaning, data analyses, and the documentation aspect?
Yeah, I don't think you can ever assume that a code is done. So, for instance, if there's like, I get to a point where I'm like, okay, I don't know what to do with this variable, or I don't know what this variable means, I might
Mm,
leave a notation to myself to come back to later that says, okay, not sure about this variable, need to email the person who's going to know about it. Be sure to follow up to fill out the information here, and then I'll check back to make sure that I address that and that I could add in that code at a later time. And then also, things could change. So you might have to go back and do some edits and make notes of that. So it might be helpful to date stuff if that's the case.
yeah,
It really just depends on the project, how many people are working on it, how large the data file is. If it's a small data set, it's just you working on it. Maybe the notes can be a little bit less. But if you're working with multiple people, it's a larger data set, more variables, all that stuff's going to add to the amount of documentation that you should include on that script.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. Something I'll throw in there too, and I picked this up in the nonprofit sector. At the top of my do files, I will say the date the the file was last updated, and then I'll say updated by who. So it'll say
Yeah.
last coded and who the last coder was, and that's something I picked up that proved pretty helpful, at least
Yep.
with the annotation. Another trick that I started doing, very similar to you, is like noting, having a note or a question. So at the very top of my do file, I'll asterisk out uh, Control F for the word note or question to skip to note and question. So you can Control F through my do files and search for the term note or question. And that's where I have like some clarifying questioning or some context that's needed surrounding that variable in my files as well.
Nice. You got to get into the R scripts, Vic. It's free,
Oh, man.
open access. Because
Yeah,
once the students leave OSU or wherever they are, they lose the access to Stata. I do
that's
think
true.
Stata is the easiest though, just because the commands are so straightforward.
Yeah.
R is very complex, but you can access it anywhere for free.
So I think there's a transition that has to happen there because one, I think with Stata, I mean, I think for the price point of Stata, you can work with it like pretty well, something like $40 for a 6 months
Oh,
license.
it's not
But
bad.
yeah, and even at like an institutional level, let's say you're an analyst at some government agency and you pay like 100 and something for the year and you can use the software. It'll bring some power relative to Excel. And I know you know that piece, but R for sure, less intuitive, I would argue,
Oh
but
yeah.
it being free. Definitely those scripts would be helpful. I actually used some R Studio for a recent project. Took some time to do it, but I don't think I'm advanced enough where I'm ready to instruct it to students. So maybe that's
Sure.
what the next iteration of some courses have to be around.
That's the next piece. Let me know when you're ready. I got tons of files.
All right, let's do it, man. So, jumping back to some of the items around documentation, um, and you kind of already have given insight in terms of what you do to make sure people can do to reproduce your file, let's say 5 years from now and such. Um, and I'm wondering whether there's a difference in how you organize do files or documentation for a larger project versus a smaller project, because you did mention like it depends on all these different variables. So does your workflow differ? What does that look like? Do you tend to use one huge do file, or do you have different ones baked out? Just a bit more of the nitty gritty there, like to understand like that day to day.
Yeah. So if it's something I'm just working on by myself,
Mhm.
it's just going to be a single do file, probably not as much notation because I know what I'm doing and I rarely would have to share that with anybody. And if I do have to share any of the data, then I'm assuming the only people who are going to access that data are people that know coding and people that can work with that data and do whatever it is they want to do with it. But if
Mhm.
it is a larger project, it depends. So when I used to work in SPSS, I would have multiple different syntax files. So I'd
Mhm.
have one file that like cleans the data. I would have another file that like combines or merges different files together. And then I would have a third file that allows me to prep the data for whatever analysis we're doing.
Yeah.
Um, for do files, I tend to put that all into one. I don't know why. I just it's when it's all there, it's just easy. I know that it's all there, and do files are easier for me to interpret and read. They don't take up as much space as a syntax file, because like one line of code in Stata could take like 6 lines of code in syntax and SPSS.
Yeah.
So there's something that's a very overwhelming about that to me to have one syntax file that's like 1,000 lines or multiple thousand lines, whereas in Stata the most I've ever gotten to is like a few hundred.
Yeah.
Um, but I can't remember what was the original question.
Also, whether your workflow differs when it comes to, let's say, larger versus smaller projects. You started pointing out, like, if it's you by yourself, it looked totally different.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Mhm.
So with the larger files, it's definitely more notations because I might need to explain it to my colleagues.
Yeah.
And I need to highlight code because, I might figure out something like, oh, cool, well, I can do this like little data check where I can like pull out a variable and like do some manipulation to it and pull out the numbers to verify if what I'm doing is producing the output that I'm expecting. And so I might note that. So, and that's been very helpful for colleagues of mine that, want to do the same thing, but they don't know how to do it. So I could share my code with them. And as long as I have it marked, I can look it up very easily, like you suggest, with the Control F and find
Yeah.
exactly that block of code and just send it right over.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember it's funny because I remember we worked together at John Jay's Research and Evaluation Center years ago. And I remember there was something where I wanted access to propensity score matching. And I remember you sending over a do file that had propensity score matching code in it for me to refer to, which was super helpful. And in some ways, when we start talking about artificial intelligence, um, could kind of speak to the way in which AI has now kind of resolved the ability to figure out code too, which will be fun to talk about in a minute. But before we kind of get to that piece, I'm wondering if there's anything else you might want to touch on in terms of just kind of basic documentation. We're focusing on DoFiles since Stata is kind of the program of choice being used right now. But anything that you might just generally want to share.
Yeah, I think, learning these coding programs can seem very overwhelming at first, especially when you've never used it before.
Yeah.
But think about it like this. If you can break it down into single commands or single lines of code, coding is a process that builds on itself. So every line of code that you have down, if you can document that and understand what it is doing, then as you become more familiar over time, you're going to go back to that code and realize that you can expand on that or use that same line of code multiple times to do the same thing to different variables. So the documentation piece is really just a shorthand way to improve your understanding of a program, but also just use that code over and over and over because, it's gotten to the point now where I've used so many different lines of code in STATA, SPSS, R, that I don't have that code memorized. So I'll have to go back to previous code sheets, syntax files, do files, and just pull that code and use it again because I already know what I want to do and I know that I've written the code before to do it. So
Yeah.
I'll copy and paste it, put it into my new file, and then just adjust the name of the data frame or the data set and the variable, and then I can do the same thing that I did before. So the documentation piece is really helpful for going back and building on that code and just reusing the same code. Because ultimately, when you're doing data cleaning, there's not that many different commands you're going to do. Like if you do like 15 commands in a data cleaning exercise, that is a lot. You're probably going to do less than 10. So it's going to be those same commands over and over and over. So documenting them just helps you to know that you can use them, apply them to future commands that you want to do.
Man, that was the chef's kiss, for lack of better words, man. That was good. That was really, really good. And a lot of it resonated with me too, and what my day-to-day routine looks like as well. It's like, oh, I got this file that has the code. I forgot what that loop looks like, or things like that. So
Yeah.
this will resonate, I'm pretty sure, with other folks who are right now having their hands in some do files, some sort of syntax or anything going on. Um, Thank you again, Doug. I would say we jump into artificial intelligence and kind of what that looks like in a bit.
Yeah.